Tonight, let the sea take the edge off your day. Make yourself comfortable. Sink into the shape of the chair or the bed beneath you, and, if it feels right, let your shoulders soften. Imagine breath as a tide. A gentle in-breath that comes in on a hush of salt, and an out-breath that goes out slowly, like a current drawing back from the shore. There is no hurry here. The story we will travel is long and slow, like the path of a moonlit swell, and it will carry you toward something quiet and steady. A secret waiting below the surface. Somewhere beyond the last light of the fishing boats, the sea kept its own counsel. It was a city under a cloak of water, where columns leaned and corridors slept in the hush between currents. Fish moved like punctuation marks. Seagrass along fallen balustrades fluttered, as if to hush the world. In this place, at the heart of an old, half-remembered legend, there stood a palace with arching halls and glass that remembered sunlight. It kept things, relics, volumes preserved in splayed cases, and a small, very particular coral that glowed in the slow hours like a thought becoming a memory. Those who knew stories called it the sea rose, and it was the very thing that would draw a weary merchant, and, later, his daughter, into the hush of the deep. A soft breath now, if you like. Let the out-breath lengthen, and imagine the salt on the air as something kind, something that will sit with you like a warm cloth. Picture the light beneath the waves. It is not bright, it is folded and kind, the color of ancient silk. We begin with the shore where the protagonist's life lay, small and practical, and full of the quiet competence that comes from careful hands. She had a name that meant gentle when translated back into the old tongue. The village called her Mara. She was neither remarkable by the town's gossip nor without cares, only the kind of person who could mend, arrange, and tidy with a patience that made ordinariness feel like a kindness. Her fingers knew how to braid rope and how to coax a candle's flame from a reluctant wick. She kept track of small things, the way a nettle would curl after being pressed, the way a seam lifted when a sleeve had been washed too hot. Her father was a fisherman merchant, the sort of man who kept accounts in his head and in a soft leather book. He had hands like worked wood, and a voice like a low bell. There had been seasons of plenty, and seasons when nets returned lighter than anyone hoped. On an evening when the gulls rode an indifferent wind, he returned with less than promise. A storm, if you can call it that without making it loud, had taken the better of his cargo. It was not the sort of tempest our story needs. No thunder to startle you, no savage pounding. Imagine instead a long, patient swell that tugged at boats and loosened knots, a tide that slid through the harbor like a slow thought and carried away a chest of goods, and with it a debt. In those days, debts were not only sums written on paper. In that town, a favor owed might mean sending someone to tend a place that kept its own rules. He came back with salt on his coat and the hollow look of someone who had lost something that was meant to bring small light into a household. Among the things he had lost, there had been a handful of the sea rose coral, pale, luminescent blooms that softened the night and had a value both practical and principal. Those corals were prized in the coastal markets for their glow and for the soft light they lent to the long winter evenings. To the palace beneath the waves, they were more than adornment. They were part of a covenant the keeper of that place held sacred. When the merchant's boat drifted near the palace on the tail of the current, someone there noticed. There are always watchers in places like that, those who keep an eye on what enters their domain. The keeper was an imposing figure, at first seen from a small, respectful distance. He moved with the slow deliberation of someone who had all the time the world could give him. His hands were large and careful, and his voice when he spoke was like the echo in a great hall, soft, taut with learning. People called him the guardian, or sometimes simply the curator, and he kept the palace's long rooms and its vaults. He had been alone for a long while, the sort of solitude that makes a person shrink inward like a shell. The village stories sketched him as grave, remote, perhaps hard, because, in the telling, strange things always look hard from the outside. But stories never tell everything. Only small acts do. When the merchant was seen with the pocket of corals gone, the guardian took notice with a calm more certain than anger. The exchange that followed was not like a courtroom drama. It was methodical and quietly binding. He required recompense. The merchant, haggard and old enough to have the stoop of a man who had known both luck and its opposite, offered what he could not actually give: words and promise. The guardian's terms were not cruel. He asked simply that someone be left to work in the palace for a season or two, to tend the lighted coral, to clean the halls, to organize the scrolls that lay in the glass cases. It was honest work, and it came with upkeep and shelter beneath the water's hush. For a man who had nothing to trade but what he had, it was a measure he accepted. Mara heard the arrangement at the kitchen table, where the kettle steamed, and their cat slept like a warm pebble. Her father spoke with that gravity a man uses when words are scarce. He did not beg. Instead, he set the ledger between them and suggested, in a way that betrayed his love, that she go and do the work. He meant it for the briefest span, a season to pay the balance with labor and presence. Mara listened, and for a long moment nothing moved but the steam. Then she rose and folded her hands the way people fold things stored for the future, and she said, slowly and plainly, that she would go. There was no romance to the choice, only a quiet duty, to offer the steadiness of hands where steadiness was wanted. She packed in small parcels, linen wrapped about the few books she carried, a shawl for the damp, a tin of sewing needles. The village gathered the smallest of comforts to lay in her palm: a dried fig, a strip of smoked fish, a coin pressed beneath a paper with a blessing. We do these things in our little rituals, because when the world feels too large we return to the muscle memory of kindness. Before she left, stand with me for a breath. Let the lungs ease in and out, long and deliberate, as if drawing the ocean's hush into your chest. Picture Mara's fingers holding the ship's rail, the sea smelling of iron and algae, the night sky a far, cold velvet. There's a tenderness in farewells that takes the shape of small things: nods, buttons fastened, an extra wrap of rope for a parcel. She stepped out to the boat at morning's tilt, and with her the tide seemed willing to take a parting slow. The journey that would find them at the palace was not dramatic. Waves did not leap like beasts. There was no blinding flash. Instead, the sea moved as a long, considerate hand beneath the keel, guiding, testing, and finally delivering. The merchant's boat drifted in a way that took it beyond where small harbor lights show their faces. Currents can be strangers, and on the sea stranger things are ordinary. He found himself loosed until he glimpsed forms beneath, columns like the ribs of the world, and glass that remembered a brighter sky. The palace showed itself at a pace that invited observation rather than alarm. At the water's edge of the palace, emissaries came in the form of small, lit fish, and a young attendant. He was not old, perhaps a little younger than Mara, and he moved with an easy, helpful attention. His name was Lior. He had the kind of face that made you feel known without being familiar. He had been taught to receive those who came by tide, the wet, the worried, the ones whose pockets were light with promise. He helped to tie the rope, to pass warm cloths, to offer a basin with water that smelled faintly of copper and lemongrass. He spoke in soft syllables, and when he told the merchant that the guardian had noticed the missing coral, there was no flourish, only the matter-of-fact solemnness of someone announcing a truth everyone must bear. The terms were stated finally on a ledge within the palace's entryway, where greenish light filtered like old silk through water, and the scaffolds of shell and stone made patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The guardian did not raise his voice. He asked simply for someone to remain and tend the house for as long as their obligation required. He explained, quietly, that the corals had their place, their covenanted role in keeping certain lights alive, that taking them without offering replacement was a matter of balance, of respect. The merchant, pressed by need and by the honesty of what was owed, agreed, and so Mara's path was decided with the polite finality of an old ledger closed and put away. If you would like, take a slow breath now, and imagine the feeling of stepping into a place at once ancient and gentle. Picture the palace's mouth, a wide arch hung with filmy weed, and inside it lamps that hummed like bees. The air below the surface is cool, but not cruel. The damp is a kind of close, a soft pressing that sits against the skin like a shawl. The sound that reaches you is muffled, as if you are inside a room full of blankets where conversation could only be the softest of things. Mara walked beneath arches that had once known the footfall of many lives, hands passing along the carved balustrades, fingertips grazing the patterns softened by salt and time. The halls were long, and they kept their own memory. The echo of a song, the nervous rustle of tide-borne dust, the low, far chiming of bell-like shells. There were lamps, bioluminescent orbs cradled in shells, that swelled and dimmed gently, casting a warm, even light. They were the palace's hearth. In the place where hearth would be on land, here there were vents that breathed warm water in lazy, life-giving plumes. A small mercy that made laundry hung to dry feel tender rather than damp. Her first nights were an adjustment in the softest of ways. Sleep came differently when the world around you breathed in its own cycle of light. The palace kept time by the movement of currents and the slow blooming of the sea-rose patch in its garden. There, beneath a collapsed colonnade, a bed of coral breathed in pale blue. Guarded and tended, it sent out light like a patient candle. Mara learned the movements one by one, how to trim the soft tendrils without shocking the colony, how to sweep without causing a storm of silt, how to open and close the small glass cases that held scrolls wrapped in algae-proof cloth. There was dignity in these labors. There was, too, a rhythm that settled a person. At first she worked with the attendant, Lior, learning which lamps needed a touch and how to coax the algae off a pane without scratching the glass. He showed her a drawer with old labels, the kind that had become green at the edges with water. He pointed to a small symbol on a case, a crescent carved inside a circle, which marked books meant to be read only in certain tides. She learned to read the quiet of the palace, the way a particular vent singed warm to the touch, the soft patter when a shoal of small fish decided to sleep against the windows. The guardian came to the work, too, but not often at first. He kept largely to his studies, his hands buried in narrow boxes full of artifacts and volumes. Those who had known him best spoke of a man who had once believed his intellect could be a kind of salvation, who had sat among the books and thought knowledge might protect him from the world's messy affections. The palace's solitude had both been chosen and imposed, until habit sealed the doors like resin. People sense another's sorrow in different ways. For Mara, it arrived as a pause in the day. She would find a long table set with only one cup, or a lamp left half-burnt, or the tremor of a voice in a sentence unfinished. There were times when the guardian's hands trembled as he withdrew a scroll, or when he lingered on a phrase as if it were a wound he was afraid to touch. Yet he was not unkind. In his care for the palace there was precision, and, beneath that, a loyalty that once seemed noble, and, over time, had become brittle. One morning, when the tide was in a soft, giving mood, Mara went to the vault to help carry a crate of seaweed-treated volumes. The light in the vault was green and patient. The shelves stood like rows of sleeping sentinels. She moved slowly so as not to stir the dust too much, and felt, without turning, the guardian arrive. He stood behind her for a moment, close enough that she felt the pause of his breath above the crown of her head. Then he spoke, not in the measured, learned way she had heard from a distance, but in something quieter. "You are careful," he said. "It is an odd thing to be praised simply for the steadiness of one's hands." Mira smiled, a small thing, and said, "I was taught to be careful. It keeps the small things from becoming big problems." He nodded, and for a beat there was an invisible handing over. The idea that small things, tended well, could steady the world. He said nothing more, but the sentence stayed between them like a light placed on a table. That evening, when Mara returned to her sleeping chamber, a cozy, curtained alcove warmed by the faint plumes of a vent, she found a book placed upon her pillow. The cover was of worn leather, the spine softened by many hands. It was a small kindness, an old volume on the cultivation of luminous flora, written in a slow, practical voice. The pages smelled faintly of salt and lemon, a scent that had become to her almost homelike. She read until the words blurred and the lamps dimmed, until her eyes, heavy with the day's quiet labors, folded shut. There are moments in new places when the world seems very large, and your place in it very small. In such times, attention to detail can be a gentle anchor. Mara took pride in learning the names of the corals, in memorizing which lamp needed a pinch of sea salt to correct its glow, in mending a torn edging on a scroll that, if left, would fray beyond repair. Her work was not heroic. It did not require battle or decree. It required patience, and in that patience her presence began to alter the palace's hum. Outside, the sea kept its seasonal rhythms. On the surface, men and women watched for the shift of currents like watchmen noting the weather. Beneath, the palace felt the same shifts as a subtle change in its bones. There were days when a warmer current slid through, and the light felt thinner and softer, like early spring. Other times the water grew denser and quieter, like the hush of late autumn. Mara learned to mark these seasons by smell as much as sight. The scent of brine grew sweeter when the shallow beds warmed, and a cool tang came when the deep shifted. She began to think of the palace not as a ruin, but as a house with forms of hospitality, living and changing in ways she could learn to navigate. The attendant Lior was a kind of bridge to the world outside. He would sometimes bring messages sent by fishermen who lived near the shore, small shipments of dried goods, or news of a neighbor's child learning to cast lines. He was fond of jokes that did not try too hard to be funny. He liked to make comparisons that drew a reluctant smile. Once, when Mara complained that a lamp had gone dim overnight, he shrugged and said, "It was merely taking a nap. Lamps, like certain people, prefer to rise when they are ready." It is this sort of gentle humor that shifts a heavy mood without being loud. Sometimes, when the pages were at rest, and the lamps sent a slow chorus across the hall, the guardian would join them in the outer corridor. He would speak then of things that were not his usual subjects, a memory of a festival light on the shore, the hum of a certain tide that smelled of spice, or an old saying he had been given as a child that had somehow lodged in him like a pebble. Mara listened. She did not attempt to solve his sorrow. She could not read the ledger of a life by sweeping a floor, and she did not presume to. But she was consistent, and her consistency proved to be a kind of balm. There was a particular patch of garden by the palace's outer-facing windows where the special sea rose had been allowed to grow for centuries, like an old friend allowed to sit in the warm corner of a room. The guardian had a sort of watchfulness over it that bordered on reverence. It was said that he would walk there at odd hours, speaking to the coral as if it were alive not only in the biological sense, but as a keeper of stories. Mara, who loved small rituals, learned how to tend it. She would trim and clean, observing the coral's pulse, the way it breathed light. It rewarded gentle hands with blooms that would open with a slow, luminous shrug. As the days folded into one another, the palace made room for her. In the hush of long afternoons, she would sit with the open pages of a book and a cup that steamed faintly. Tea brewed from dried kelp and a bead of citrus, and feel the palace's rhythm settle into something she could bear. It was like learning the tempo of a piece of music. Once you knew the pattern, you could allow yourself to drift within it. One evening, not long after she had arrived, Lior came to the kitchen with a message that had the sort of small importance that makes people stand straighter when they hear it. "There will be a tide gathering," he said, naming an old coastal custom that was less about spectacle and more about the steady acknowledgement of the community above the water. It was a time when those on the shore offered thanks for the season and named those who had done good. They invited sometimes certain houses to send representatives. Mara's thoughts lifted briefly to her village, her father's stooped shape at the table, the kettle's soft note. There was a pull to home that had the shape of a tide as well. The guardian listened to the news with something like reserve. In his face was a quiet that suggested old reasons kept him from surface gatherings. He disliked the idea of being watched, of being seen in a way that might conjure curiosity instead of attention. Yet there was a thing within him that longed to be recognized, not as spectacle but as a person whose edges had been dulled by time and solitude. At night, after the lamps hummed and the patrol fish curled into the alcoves, Mara lay awake for a while with the book she had found earlier. She traced the script with her fingertips and thought of the merchant's hands and his weathered apology. She thought of her own smallness and the peculiar largeness of choosing a steady life. There is a particular kind of tired that ends in a warm acceptance. Like a blanket folded over your knees, she allowed herself that tired and let the palace's light fold her close. Our tale, gentle listener, moves slowly as promised. The path ahead will see Mara learning more of the guardian's past, the careful unthreading of his longer sorrow, and an invitation that reaches beyond the palace's arches, a subtle, careful crossing that will ask of compassion more than many expect. For now, let your breath return, if you have moved it, to its ordinary, patient measure. Imagine the palace at night. Lamps like soft moons, curtains of weed tracing slow figures, the sea breathing all around it. If this voyage feels like one you would like to make again, there are more stories that travel in this quiet way. A gentle follow will bring them when you need them. Nothing more than a small, soft tap that keeps this sort of journey at your fingertips. When the morning came after her first month within the palace, Mara rose to a world washed in light that seemed to come from inside the sea itself. The windows were broad and cupped in green, and the frail sun above the waves threaded silver through a column of water like a single thin cord. The palace, which had seemed to sleep at night, now breathed in gentle rhythms. She moved through her early tasks with the ease of someone who had begun to know the house's leanings. The way a certain window fogged when the kettle was hot. The way a particular shelf creaked when a book was taken. In the main hall, she found the guardian waiting as if to see how she would meet the day. He watched her as she tended to the sea rose patch. He did not intrude. He merely observed, and in the way he looked there was something that suggested a calculus at work, an accounting of small things, perhaps a reconsideration. Once, when she had to prune a particularly stubborn branch of coral, he offered a thin-handled instrument that had belonged to a long line of palace caretakers. "Careful," he said, and the single word was not patronizing. It was an admission that he, too, had once had small hands at work. Time moved this way. Not with the bang of sudden change, but with the steady turn of small acts. Mara mended a torn edge on a map that had belonged to a traveler many ages ago. She polished a bell that had lost its chime and found at last that it made a soft note when struck. It was a note that did not summon crowd or ceremony, only a private, neat satisfaction. She learned the guardian's favorite passages in the books he kept close, not to pry, but to make conversation. He would, sometimes, pass a small remark about the nature of certain currents, and she would reply with an anecdote from the village, folding the distance between their lives like the pages of a well-read book. There was a day when she found, tucked behind a case of glass, an object that had been obscured by time, a small pearl set in a band of woven kelp. It was not ostentatious. It had the unshowy, true value of comfort. Mara did not know its story, but she smiled and put it in the palm of the guardian's hand when he came to see the repaired lamp. He looked at it for longer than she expected, then returned it to its place. Sometimes the most meaningful things are meant to be seen and then put back, held in the memory rather than worn. Even so, there were whispers that moved like scent through the corridors, rumors of a tide gathering on the shore, of the season's small festival where the village would name those who had done good for their mutual well-being. Mara felt the tug to go, to stand in the hush of surface air and see her father and the other faces familiar to her. The guardian watched her consider it and said nothing. Only when the choice was made and she prepared a small parcel to take with her, a piece of the repaired map, a strip of cloth folded neat, did he speak. "If you go," he said, "carry this thought. Not every gaze is a questioning. There are those who look to see if we are as we have always been. There are others who look to know us better." His voice had the soft gravity of someone who had been inside libraries too long and found in the margins a human warmth he had been reluctant to accept. Mara nodded. There was no heavy counsel, no dramatic imperative. It was, as most things here had been, an offering of small truth. She left with Lior to the edge of the palace where the line between water and air thinned, and, as she stepped, the light above the surface was a clean, thin thing. The village, with its narrow lanes and the kettle's constant note, folded gently back into view. As she walked familiar streets, people greeted her with the sort of measured surprise that comes from noticing someone who has begun to glow from within. Her father's face softened when he saw her, and for a moment the ledger of the last months fell still. She spoke little of the palace then, offering instead the tangible: spliced rope, a mended shirt, a small loaf tucked in her palm. And in return she received the village's small treasures: the warm coal from a neighbor's hearth, a handful of salted lemons, a child's drawing of a boat. The tide gathering itself was quiet in the way of good things. It did not swell into spectacle, but moved like a current that lowers and lifts with small, systematic grace. There were names read, and small tokens handed, the sort of communal exchange that stitches a people together. When the idea of the palace was brought up, indirectly, carefully, there was a polite murmur. People in small towns are shy of the strange. They are also curious in a way that sometimes feels like light. Mara spoke then, without flourish, of the work and the dignity of small labor. She did not ask them to be anything more than themselves. But the guardian's presence is awkward in any gathering where he is not expected. Whether they would accept him if he came to shore was a question that seemed to hover at the edge, like a cloud that could either open to sun or settle to rain. Mara considered this and felt the weight of an invitation she had not given. She knew, in that odd, inside way that steady people know, that companionship requires courage. Not the clamorous kind, but rather the quiet decision to stand with someone when it feels easier to stay home. On the last evening, before she returned to the palace, Mara sat with her father. The harbor lay in the soft dark like a folded garment, and the lamp over the kitchen table made the ledger gleam. He looked at her as though trying to measure her by the light. "Go with the knowledge that steadiness matters," he said. "There is nothing noble in leaving. There is nothing small in staying. You have always known that." She hugged him. The embrace was brief but whole. Then she turned toward the water and the path back to a place where lamps breathed in green. As the palace received her once more, the sea settled with the kind of welcome that makes the world feel as though it had been waiting for you all along. Leor met her at the gates with a small grin and a bundle of sea bread warm from the ovens. The guardian watched from the shadow of an arch, and for a single evening they all sat with their quiet tasks and their unsaid things. It is here, with the house returning to its soft rhythms and Mara's place becoming more clearly carved, that our first long stretch of the story draws to a place of transition. She will continue to learn the subtleties of the palace and its keeper. Small revelations will pass between them like folded notes, and the palace's light will respond to the patient attention it is given. There are secrets in the vaults, old stories waiting to be read, and a restlessness that will move not as thunder, but as a gentle turning. Breathe in now, and let the out-breath lower the energy in your body. Picture Mara by the sea rose patch, hands darkened in the quiet work, the guardian standing a little way off with a book in his hand. The lamps hum the same low note, and the palace, patient as a sleeping thing, keeps its own watch. The tide will shift again, as tides do, and it will bring new faces and a small, careful reckoning. For now, allow your shoulders to relax into the mattress of the night, and imagine the palace's lamps folding you into their soft light. The days that followed spread out like a map that was slowly being drawn, each small circuit of work tracing a line that made the palace's shape feel more like home. Mara rose with the lamps that kept their own time, moving through tasks she had begun to know as faithfully as the lines of her own hands. She cleaned the glass panes until they held the green light like a kept promise. She learned which scuttle would give a soft, steady heat, and which would flare if stroked too hard. Lior taught her the names of certain maintenance knots, the little twists sailors use to keep a rope from slipping in the damp. The knotwork looked like miniature gardens in his weathered fingers, and he took a quiet pleasure in demonstrating how a loop could both hold fast and yet be easy to let go. It was in these small occupations that the palace's life became intimate. Mara found that when she smoothed a stained label on a glass case or brushed silt from a carved relief, the act itself held an unassuming grace. There were mornings she spent retying the banners that hung across the dining alcove. Long strips of woven seaweed dyed with ground shells so they kept the memory of certain colors. And in the afternoons she would sit by the vault with a thin brush, coaxing salt from between page fibers until the paper sighed like a relieved thing. These were not heroic gestures. They were quiet service, the kind that wears time into goodness. The guardian watched these habits with an attention that softened with each day. He did not speak of his loneliness in the manner of confession. Rather, it arrived as a series of small admissions embodied in gesture. Once, he left a bowl of the palace's slow-cooked kelp stew by the door to her sleeping alcove. Not in a formal gift, but as if he imagined she might be hungry on a night when the lamps were low. Another time, when a lamp stuttered in the east corridor and made a thin, tremulous noise, he paused and spent an hour attending to it with the ease of someone who had long known the ways of delicate things. Mara noticed, and in noticing she placed value upon these acts by returning them in kind, mending a torn sleeve, cutting a strip of cloth to make a new label, or simply arranging a tray of bread and citrus by his study door. As the weeks turned, the palace's seasons whispered past like the slow turning of a page. There was a span when a warmer current came through, and the sea light thinned to a pale gold that made everything look as though it had been painted with a very soft brush. The gardens felt more animated. Little creatures came to rest on the coral like lovers slipping onto a bench. Then the water grew cooler, and the glow tightened into a deep, resonant blue. The palace settled into a more inward mood, and the lamps burned with a steadier cadence. Mara marked these changes by the taste in the tea, slightly sweeter when the current warmed, and, by the way, certain scrolls seemed to prefer being consulted at different times. She learned that the palace's clock was not a clock of hands but of currents, of subtle thermal breaths that made their own schedule. On some evenings, after the daily work and the small shared chores, the guardian would emerge with a book and sit at a modest table in the hall. His reading was not ostentatious. He did not do it to show that he knew, but because books had been his companions. Mara came to understand that his studies had once been a way to stave off a fear of being hurt by the world. Knowledge, he had thought, could be an armor. Over the years, though, armor had calcified into isolation. His mind had gathered treasures, maps, folios, theories about currents and the old songs of seafarers, but his heart had grown cautious, as if the door to companionship might wear away the edges of his dignity. One quiet afternoon, as the palace outside the windows shimmered with a thin, silvering light, Mara found him in the library, working with a small, coral-inlaid instrument. He had not meant to be noticed. He was bent over a sheet of vellum, repairing a delicate diagram. She hesitated at the door and then stepped in. There was a calm that had the texture of respect between them now, neither being hurried nor intrusive. "You mend patiently," he said, more to himself than to her. The phrase slipped into the room like an offering. She looked up, fingers still stained with a fine dust. "It takes the same patience as repairing a net. You don't hurry what wants to be steady." He considered this, and for a moment his face relaxed. "Steadiness," he repeated. "Perhaps that is what I traded once for understanding. I thought the two were different. Knowledge as a way to control. I did not see that steady hands are a kind of knowing too." There was no confession in these words that demanded theatrical response. Mara merely nodded, letting the sentence rest. It was enough that recognition had been given. It hung between them like a small light, acknowledged and sufficient. Their conversations, when they came, were slow and practical. He would ask about a knot, a color mixing, the name of a seam. She would tell him about the village's unusual festival customs, the way people wrapped small blessings in paper and tied them to chimneys. Sometimes they spoke of the books he kept, and he would show her a marginal note that belonged to an author from ages ago. An observation about a tide that would pull back a boat an extra arm's length if the moon favored such mischief. These conversations were not grand. They were the kind of exchange that builds a life, a shared joke, a mutual curiosity, the soft acknowledgement that someone else knows the map you now tread. A small vignette came to be repeated between them, a quiet ritual that seemed to stitch a thread through the days. The palace possessed an old, brass-bound lantern, whose glass had gathered a fine film of salt through years of low light. Its flame never burned high. It gave a measured reassurance rather than blaze. One morning, the mechanism that turned the lenticular globe stuck. Mara took the lantern down and sat with it in the workshop. The brass was warm under her palms. Lior offered a small cloth and a bowl of warm water. The guardian fetched a needle-like tool from a drawer where he kept instruments that had names no one else used. They worked together in companionable silence, Mara loosening the joints, Lior obliging with steady hands, the guardian coaxing the globe back to patience with his fine instrument. When at last the lantern turned easily, releasing a gentle bloom of light, there was a soft, unannounced cheer, the kind that grows in the chest rather than in the voice. The guardian smiled, small and private, and the light felt as though it had paid back a debt that had been owed to the room for years. These domestic moments were the things that quietly remade the guardian. He grew less rigid in the way he moved. His voice lost a hardness that had arrived from a long habit of self-protection. Once, when a visiting scholar's courier left a box of journals by the outer hall and forgot to tie the knot properly, Mara took the parcel and retied it with a simple sailor's knot. The guardian watched her hands, and he remarked, almost in passing, that he had been taught a different knot as a boy, one that was used in the making of sails. The anecdote opened a small window. He spoke then of a childhood along a certain promontory, of a father who whistled while he mended nets. He laughed softly at the memory, and the laughter, small as it was, sounded like a crack in a long winter ice. Not all revelations were spoken. Some arrived by way of observation, the kind that seeps into a room as scent does through curtains. Mara noticed, for instance, that the guardian's study held a drawer full of folded maps of places he had never been to since youth. In one of these maps she found little corners annotated with notes that read like prayers. For when the tides are kind. For the night of soft rains. They were not the notes of a man looking only to knowledge. They were the marginalia of someone who had once hoped to be part of the world he studied, and had closed the door out of fear of disappointment. As the months advanced, the palace's garden changed in subtle ways. The sea rose patch that had once seemed to live on habit and memory grew fuller under Mara's care. She found that the coral responded to touch that was both firm and tender. The blooms opened with a certain eagerness, softening the lamp's green with their own pale, luminous blush. The guardian stood often at a window there, watching without interfering, and in his watchfulness there was a gentleness that she found comforting. Once, while pruning a particularly stubborn tendril, Mara noticed a bud forming where, according to the palace records, none had been seen for years. She touched the new bloom as if offering it a benediction. It glowed like a small secret, and when the guardian saw it he placed his hand upon the glass, scarcely daring to press. "It is as if the house remembers itself when someone listens," he said. "You listen to it," Mara answered. "You listen by staying." The idea that staying could be an act of attention and heroism grew in them both. It gave shape to their days. Not grand heroics, but the repeated choice to tend, speak, and be present. Those choices, compounded over time, folded the palace's life into a new texture. Word of these small improvements drifted, in the way that news does in coastal communities, as a scent that catches the breeze and moves to a new neighbor. Lior, who kept friendly relations with the shore, carried messages and small parcels, and sometimes he would return with a story about how a fisher had remarked on the brighter light in a particular window, or how a market-goer had seen a faint glow across the water, and spoken of it as a sign of good tending. These reports warmed the guardian in a way that made him more willing to allow surface people brief, supervised visits. He did not seek praise. He simply received acknowledgment with a simpler face. The festival tide came in like a gentle chapter break, the kind of event that asks not for loud rejoicing but for communal acknowledgment. The tide gathering on the shore was not an uproar of banners and bands. Rather, it was a measured thing. People came bearing small tokens, songs hummed in familiar keys, and offerings were made at the edge of the water. Pieces of woven cloth, a handful of grain, a carved shell. The village named good deeds softly, and it took a kind of courage to step forward as a representative. Mara had planned, for some time, to invite the guardian. She did not do so as a dramatic gesture. She did it because she had come to know him, and because she thought, perhaps optimistically, that those who had known only the surface's half-told tales might see him differently if they met him in calm company. When she asked him, she did so in the way one asks another to share a quiet painting, without pressure, with the offer to step back if the other desired. He hesitated, as he had been accustomed to do when the world required his exposure. "What if they look at me," he said, voice low, "and see only what the story made of me?" Mara smiled with the steady warmth she had honed into habit. "Then we'll be there to show them otherwise," she said. "We'll show them the hands that keep lights and the ways a person can be kind. It is not so heavy a thing." He agreed with a small nod, and the two of them, accompanied by Lior, made the slow ascent to the surface. The crossing between the green hush of the palace and the air above was like walking from a soft dream into a more sharply painted room. Lior handled the lines and tended the small basket of offerings with the practicality that made him both companion and bridge. The light above was thin and bright in a way that made faces look clear. People gathered at the water's edge. They had brought tokens and children who clung to their knees, as well as quiet elders who had the practice of watching tides with clinical patience. The guardian's arrival was met with a particular variety of attention. Some gazes were straightforwardly curious, others were cautious, waiting for some sign of impropriety that was never forthcoming. When he spoke, careful words about stewardship and the importance of balance in the currents. People listened. He did not attempt to charm them with grand histories. Instead, his voice settled to the rhythms of ordinary speech, naming the palace's small projects, the way they had restored certain lamps, and the patient work of tending the sea rose. In doing so, he offered himself as a person who had been capable of care. A moment came when an elder of the village, a woman with sea-salted hair, stepped forward and placed a small token, a string of shells, into the guardian's hand. The gesture was simple, without ceremony, and carried the weight of recognition. "We tend each other's fires," she said, "even the ones we cannot see from our own windows." The guardian's eyes softened. Where once such an action might have been received with suspicion, now it arrived as a small balm. The community's acceptance was not immediate or grand. It was the work of a day and of many days, stitched quietly into a fabric that had learned to recognize steady, humble service. Those who had once seen him as a figure of fearful legend now began to speak his name in tones that sounded like respect rather than warning. There was no sudden, spectacular transformation of his appearance. The story's magic was not in the unmaking of a shell or the snapping of an enchantment, but in the way perception changed when others offered recognition rather than fear. The guardian's features did not melt into something else. Instead, the lines of his face softened in the light of being known. Where there had been distance, there was now proximity. Where there had been the cautiousness of isolation, there was a willingness to be seen. This was the sort of release that comes not from a spell, but from the simplest of human acts. Being met in your steadiness. Back at the palace, Leor and Mara tended to a small celebration that mirrored the village's modest sincerity. They prepared a table with sea bread and kelp preserves, and the lamps were polished until their light felt like a chorus of soft voices. The cathedral of columns, if one could call it that in private, seemed to breathe in delight. The sea rose glowed brighter, as if responding to the new ease in the air. In the days that followed, the palace felt fuller in a good way. There were more visitors, minders who came to consult its maps, a cartographer curious about the old currents who promised to bring a volume of charts, an elderly woman who taught Mara a method of weaving that made small sacks less likely to split. Each guest brought with them the ordinary kindnesses of a community refreshed. The guardian, for his part, took to greeting them with a tempered curiosity that had the steadiness of someone resuming a practice he had set aside for too long. A small, private exchange between Mara and the guardian deepened their bond into one of shared custodianship. One late evening, when the lamps hung with a particular hush, and a shoal of wandering fish brushed the windows in a soft, rhythmic way, he offered her a small gift. The pearl set in a woven band that had once been hidden behind the glass. He did not press it into her hand with drama. Instead, he placed it on a table and left it there, as if offering it to the room's air to decide. Mara lifted it and felt its cool, ordinary weight. "Why give this to me?" she asked at last, in a voice that was half curiosity and half wonder. He regarded her with a directness that had become easier for him. "It has been a thing of memory," he said. "I realized, slowly and with a slowness that felt rather like shame at times, that I kept it because it reminded me of a version of myself that was less frightened. You gave that back to the house. You gave it to the lamps and the plants and the people who come. I thought it fitting that you have something that bears witness to that hands-on work." She did not blush. She simply smiled and slid the pearl into a small pocket she wore close to her heart. It was not a promise made loudly. It was a recognition of shared purpose. The object itself became less important than what it signified, a mutual acceptance of care and of belonging. Time carried on in the patient way it always had. The palace's vaults yielded small treasures, fragments of maps, a sealed letter from a mariner that smelled faintly of lemon peel, a child's drawing pressed between leaves that showed an imaginative boat with sails like shells. Mara methodically restored and catalogued these things. She learned to bind a brittle page so that fingers might touch it without tearing, and she discovered the pleasure of recording a label that would guide another's hands a century hence. There were quieter moments when she and the guardian sat in the garden and watched sunlight fold into the water in a slow, deliberate choreography. On one such afternoon he told her, in a voice that carried an old ache, the story of how he had first taken upon himself the role of keeper. He spoke not in the language of grand intentions, but in the plain accounting of someone who had sought refuge in learning when life had offered him wounds. "I thought," he admitted, "that if I could understand the patterns of things, the world might yield its dangers. I built a place for certainty and thought that would be enough. It was a kind of shelter. But a shelter that is closed becomes a prison to the person inside it." She heard him without impatience. Mara had learned not to rush the unspooling of a long sorrow. Instead, she sat with it, letting the words make their gentle work. There was a moment when the guardian paused and looked at the coral diffusing its soft glow. "You taught me the difference between tending and hoarding," he said, and the sentence landed like a small bell. Their companionship deepened into a stewardship that neither of them framed with high emotion. They planned small projects together, a new way to arrange certain shelves so the scrolls would breathe better, a neat bed of crushed shell to lay beneath a delicate line of coral to prevent silt from settling. They set a schedule for visiting the market, and Lior would occasionally bring word of a neighbor who had news. But now the news felt less like a test, and more like the fabric of daily life. In time, a subtle sort of ceremony took place in the garden, a small act that signposted both gratitude and a new beginning. The palace did not ask for festivals wrought with pomp. Instead, Mara crafted a modest garland of woven seagrass and tiny shell beads. She threaded the pearl into the center and presented it to the guardian. The gesture was not about possession, but about shared custody, a signal that what they tended together belonged to the place and to the people whom the palace sheltered, and not merely to an isolated keeper who had once believed solitude to be a virtue. He accepted the garland with a humility that showed he had learned the value of being seen. He placed it around a pedestal near the sea rose, a kind of offering rather than a display. The palace, as though in immediate recognition, seemed to exhale. A shoal of bioluminescent minnows drifted by the windows and dimmed to a softer chorus, and a lamp that had been low flickered steady. Soon after, there came a visitor whose arrival was quiet but meaningful. A woman from a neighboring settlement had journeyed for a particular reason. Her grandson, who loved the Sea Rose stories, had sent a small drawing and asked if the palace would look after it. The woman, stooped with age but bright-eyed, entered and found the guardian and Mara tending the garden. She offered no theatrics. She left the drawing among the plants and said simply, "There is comfort in places that keep their world well. Thank you." The guardian bowed, a small gesture, and the woman left with the calm composure of someone who had visited a place that kept its promises. Her visit was not a turning of the world, but it was a kind of witness that multiplied the weight of what had been done. The palace kept renewing itself in this way, one quiet witness at a time. People came and went, and the guardian learned, with a grace that had to be practiced every day, how to be seen without fear. He still had his quiets, his times alone with books and maps, and he still preferred that some scrolls be opened only at certain tides, as was the old custom. But the habitual sharpness with which he once cut himself off from others had softened into an acceptance that living well included being part of a shared breathing. The seasons continued to weave themselves into the narrative. A cooler current came, and a winter under the sea arrived, if winter under water can be so described, with the light tightening and the lamps leaning into their slow, steady glow. Mara prepared for this rhythm by mending heavier cloths, by double-lining windows with a thin woven mesh that kept the chill from creeping in. The palace's work slowed in the way a choir settles into a restful hymn. Fewer visitors, a more concentrated attentiveness to the inner rooms. In those days, there were long stretches of quiet where the only notable sounds were the soft stroke of a brush and the patient ticking of a repaired clockwork device that had once stood in the guardian's study. It was during this hush that an unexpected smallness occurred. An episode that felt more like the smoothing of a wrinkle than any thunderous revelation. A child from the village, curious and daring, slipped away from a parent's hand to peer into the palace's garden from the shore. Lior noticed the child's dark head bobbing at the water's edge, and rather than scold or frighten the youngster, he fetched the child a small jar of warmed seawater filled with shimmering plankton, and waved it like a simple gift. The child's delight was immediate and unreserved, and the sound of that child laughing carried across the water like a bright note. The guardian, who at once would have hoped to keep children at bay lest they ruin something, watched the scene with a softening that could hardly be described as anything but joy. There were days when Mara caught herself thinking about the smallness of courage required to continue in ordinary acts, to return to the same lamp each evening and polish it, to tend the coral even on days when little seemed to change, to walk back into the library and open a book whose pages felt like brittle promises. These were not acts of singular heroism, but pieces of a larger, quiet bravery. She recognized, with a kind of tenderness for herself, that the courage of her life was of the kind that did not demand banners. It was a courage made of the constancy of kindness. The turning point in the guardian's own narrative was similarly gentle. He had carried for so long the weight of a belief that his own worth rested on the strictness of his mind and the shelter of solitude. Mara's presence eroded neither his learning nor his dignity. Instead, it created space for a different way to be proud, one rooted in the careful attention to others. He began to invite those he trusted, Mara, Lior, and a few chosen visitors, into the study where he kept the more fragile volumes. There he retold certain small stories, not as proofs of intellectual superiority, but as handoffs, as gifts. He would read a passage slowly and then say, "I once thought that by keeping knowledge I kept myself safe. I was wrong. I kept myself small instead." On such an evening, after a passage about the habits of old mariners, he closed the book and looked at Mara. "Thank you," he said. It was short, unadorned, and it carried with it an entire cartography of meanings. She smiled, and the room's lamps felt fuller for it. As months rounded into a year of sorts by the palace's count, the place felt renewed. The sea rose garden thrummed with health, the vaults breathed without dust storms, and people who came over the water did so with a confidence that had been earned gradually. The guardian no longer was a figure whose name was told as a warning. He had become a keeper in the gentlest sense, someone who watched and tended and accepted the community's small manifestations of gratitude. The final segment of the journey, if one might call it that, was not a finale of spectacle. There was no trumpet, no blaze of transformative light. Instead, there was a change of posture in the palace and within the people who tended it. The guardian, in a move that had all the weight of slow revelation, invited the village elder who had earlier offered the shells to a modest tea. They sat by the sea rose patch and talked of currents and of the art of repair. No grand apologies were necessary. Instead, there was a trade of understanding. The elder asked him, in her soft way, to tell one small story that had brought him to the palace way back when. He obliged, and within the telling there was an admission of error and of learning. The elder listened and then said, "We all carry such things. The house is better for you being here, stewarding what you can." This, more than any magic, was the guardian's freedom. He had been freed, not by an outside hand, but by being held in the attention of community. People saw him and found him steady and kind. The palace itself, which had once been a house that kept to itself, now nested within a web of mutual tending. Mara and the guardian set in motion a quieter, ongoing pact of stewardship. They turned the pearl some time later into a small symbol that signified nothing formal but everything intimate. A tiny ring worn by those who labored in the palace, a token of the house's silent covenant with the community. They agreed that the palace would continue to guard certain books and traditions, but that it would also be a place where people could come if they needed a quiet hand and a steady lamp. It was a modest promise, sustained by day-to-day practice. In the epilogue of the tale, the quiet part that folds the story into sleep, the palace had taken on the comfortable order of a household that knows itself. The lamps burned with the same warm cadence. The sea rose remained luminous and frank. The vaults waited like patient libraries. Mara moved about, now with a certainty that was both professional and affectionate. She had woven herself into the rhythm of the place. The guardian tended his studies and no longer shut the world out. Lior continued to be the amiable bridge, carrying stories and simple jokes that landed like small, necessary spices. There is a quiet moral to such patience. It is not that the palace had changed overnight or that people had been suddenly enlightened. Rather, what altered was the muscle of attention, how people chose to look and how they chose to act. Kindness, in its repeated acts, became the palace's architecture. It reshaped the place in stealthy ways, like water slowly smoothing stone. Now, as the lamps dim and the palace breathes its low, steady breath, let your own breath follow that gentle cadence. If you would like, inhale slowly, drawing the hush of the sea into your chest. On the out-breath, let your shoulders soften as the tide loosens from the shore. Imagine Mara walking once more through the garden, her hands finding the seam of coral that needs a careful trim. Imagine the guardian at his window, the pearl's small light near him, content in the way contentment can be earned through work and companionship. Picture the lamps, pale orbs cradled in shells, each one a safe and watchful eye. Picture the sea rose whose blooms hold the memory of nights and of the kindness that tended them. Imagine the palace's halls, not as empty chambers, but as rooms filled with the soft patter of caring action, the shush of pages turned with respect, the low laughter shared over a modest meal. Let the waters hush surround you. The currents move slowly here. Imagine them as the rise and fall of your own breath. There is nothing pressing for you to do but to rest in this image, and to let the day slide from you like a garment folded at the edge of a bed. The palace keeps its watch. The lamps will hold their light, and the sea will keep its secret. If you found comfort in this voyage beneath the waves, A gentle follow will bring you more stories like this one. Quiet journeys that travel slowly and land soft. Only if it suits you, a small mark will keep such tales at hand. And now, as the palace's lamps narrow their glow and the sea draws a deeper veil, allow yourself to sink into the slow unwinding of the night. Breathe in softly as though drawing in the green light itself, and breathe out letting the current take the day's edges. Feel the gentle weight of the place behind you, the steadiness of hands, the warmth of lamps, the quiet testimony of small acts, laying itself like a blanket across your shoulders. The last things to hold are simple. The knowledge that kindness alters things in small, dependable ways. The sense that to stay and tend is often the truest form of courage. And the image of lamps folding you into calm. Let those images drift through your mind like small shells across pale sand. The palace breathes on. The sea rose glows. Mara's hands have done enough for one evening, and the guardian reads by the soft lamplight, satisfied that the house keeps its promises. In that company you are welcome to let your eyes close, to let your mind follow the current into slow, deep water, where you will rest, and, if it is time, you will sleep. The light grows softer. Drift, sleep,